They fired me in front of the board like I was disposable. But what Richard, our proud CEO, didn't know was that I'd been keeping the receipts for years. Every fake profit, every buried debt, every shady contract, archived, time-stamped, ready to surface. When the truth hit, it wouldn't be quiet. It would be live, public, and irreversible. That's the risk of silencing the one person who knows where the bodies are buried. You mistake compliance for weakness. This collapse didn't just take down a company. It took down an empire. Before I continue my story, where are you watching from? Hit that like and subscribe. Trust me, you'll want to hear how this unfolds. They called me into the boardroom at 9 in the morning, just as the coffee was cooling in the lobby. Richard, our CEO, sat at the head of the table with his trademark smirk, the kind of grin that belonged more to a sales pitch than a leader. Around him were the directors, finance officers, and HR, already waiting with papers spread neatly across the table. My name sat in bold across the top of the packet. "Effective immediately," Richard said, voice clipped, as though firing me was a simple line item. HR slid the termination folder toward me, the word terminated stamped across the front in red, like a scarlet letter. I'd spent 12 years building financial frameworks for this company. 12 years turning chaotic spreadsheets into systems executives could parade before investors. I wasn't naive. I knew Richard had grown tired of my warnings. The way I insisted real numbers told a darker story than the polished slides he liked to flaunt. But what stunned me wasn't that I was being dismissed. It was the performance of it. In front of every board member, no quiet conversation, no dignity. Just a public execution meant to erase me with a signature. Richard leaned back in his chair, fingers drumming against the polished oak. "You've done good work, Natalie, but it's time for fresh vision." He said it like a toast, expecting polite applause. Some of them shifted uncomfortably, but no one defended me. In that moment, humiliation burned hotter than anger. I forced myself to nod, sliding the folder toward me as though I were agreeing with him. What Richard didn't know, and what made my silence dangerous, was that I had been preparing for this exact moment. For years, I'd built a private archive, every discrepancy, every fake profit line, every hidden liability logged and sealed. My protection wasn't an argument or a threat, it was a system already in motion. By firing me so publicly, Richard thought he'd ended my relevance, but all he did was press the start button on his own collapse. The board thought they'd witnessed my downfall. What they didn't realize was that they'd just witnessed the opening act of theirs. The truth is, I never trusted Richard from the beginning. He arrived with big promises and flashy slogans about reinventing corporate culture. But behind the Polish was a man who thrived on cutting corners. Where others saw a charismatic leader, I saw someone who treated numbers like clay, bending them into whatever shape pleased investors. That was why, years earlier, I started keeping my own records. Not a diary, not a scrapbook, an archive. Every quarterly adjustment he ordered, every expense buried under consulting fees, every debt kicked into the next cycle. I saved it. I didn't just collect files, I built a system. Each discrepancy was paired with proof. Emails, contracts, timestamps, authorizations signed in ink. I tucked them away in encrypted packages, designed to unlock only when triggered by a specific condition. My condition was simple. If my access was revoked, the system would no longer pause the scheduled disclosures. They would send themselves. First to my private vault, then to the people who mattered most. The board, the regulators, the investors who had been spoon-fed illusions for years. I never told anyone about it. Why would I? To them, I was just the quiet analyst who made sure the math worked, the one they could overrule when the numbers didn't fit the story they wanted to sell. But I knew one day that arrogance would turn on me. Executives like Richard never imagine consequences until it's too late. So I coded them into inevitability. My archive wasn't about revenge when I built it. It was insurance, protection against being blamed for crimes I refused to commit. I told myself it was only precaution, a safety net I hoped would never be used. But when Richard staged my firing in front of the board, he pulled the lever himself. The archive was no longer dormant. Its first wave was already queued, an encrypted packet ticking toward a delivery. The irony was almost poetic. Richard thought removing me from the picture would silence the truth. Instead, he guaranteed it would speak louder than I ever could. He took away my seat at the table, but I had already set the table on fire. When I walked out of that boardroom, I didn't protest, didn't slam the door, didn't give Richard the satisfaction of seeing me crack. The others expected me to plead or at least argue for my position, but I'd already made peace with what was coming. My silence wasn't defeat. It was strategy. In corporate life, loud exits are remembered for a week, but quiet exits linger like a shadow. I gathered my things calmly, leaving behind no hint of the storm I had set in motion. As I slipped my ID badge into the security tray, the system was already counting down. The first wave of disclosures was encrypted, queued, and set to release. Richard believed he had wiped me from relevance in one meeting. What he couldn't see was that the company's lifeline was built on the truths I had preserved, and those truths had been scheduled to surface without my hand on the wheel. I didn't need to leak a thing. All I had to do was walk away. No grand speeches, no social media rants, no whispered warnings to allies inside. The system didn't need me anymore. It was autonomous, untouchable, and already moving toward the inboxes of people Richard couldn't control. And that was the cruel beauty of it. By firing me in public, Richard thought he was ending my story. What he never realized was that he'd given me the perfect opening chapter to his downfall. My silence wasn't weakness. It was the sound of inevitability. 2 weeks after my firing, the first wave arrived. At exactly 9:15 a.m., just as the system was designed, encrypted packets unlocked themselves in the inboxes of every board member. What they saw wasn't fire and brimstone, not yet. It was subtle. Growth lines that didn't reconcile, profit margins that shrank when raw data replaced the polished slides, expense accounts that bled in places they were told were balanced. At first, they dismissed it as accounting noise, another spreadsheet error from some mid-level staffer. Richard brushed it off with his usual arrogance, calling it a distraction. But this wasn't noise. Each number carried a signature, each adjustment linked back to his directives. The first wave wasn't designed to topple the house. It was designed to make the floor creak. Doubt doesn't shout, it whispers. And I made sure the whisper was loud enough to keep them awake at night. While they debated whether to flag the issue or bury it, the second wave was already locked in the queue. Contracts, settlements, and compliance reports they had signed without reading. They thought they were looking at glitches. What they were really seeing was the first fracture in their foundation. And once a fracture begins, it doesn't stop spreading. The real collapse began on a Tuesday morning during the quarterly investor live stream, the stage Richard loved most. He thrived on theatrics, the spotlight of cameras, the artificial applause of executives trained to nod on cue. Dressed in his tailored navy suit, he strode onto the stage as if he were a celebrity instead of a man drowning in liabilities. Behind him, the massive screen displayed the same glossy deck they had recycled quarter after quarter. Record profits, aggressive growth, endless opportunity. Investors filled the auditorium seats, and thousands more tuned in online. Richard gripped the clicker like a conductor's baton, smug as he delivered his opening line about another historic quarter. For a moment, it almost looked convincing. Almost. But then the slides began to change, not with a glitch, not with static, but with precision. Line by line, the fabricated numbers were overwritten in real time. The inflated profits shrank into losses. The new contracts flipped red and read terminated. Debt figures, once hidden in obscure footnotes, surfaced in bold across the screen. It was my archive speaking, projecting the truth where lies once lived. Richard froze mid-sentence. The audience murmured, then erupted in questions. The live chat window filled with panic. Is this real? Where are these numbers coming from? Sell. The stock ticker at the bottom of the feed began to wobble, then plummet. Richard clicked furiously, trying to advance slides, but every attempt only revealed more. Severance payouts disguised as bonuses, acquisitions written off as losses, compliance warnings ignored. The CFO rushed onto the stage, whispering frantically in Richard's ear, but the microphone picked it up. Investors heard every desperate word, every attempt to label the revelations as a technical malfunction. But this was no malfunction. This was evidence. Legal contracts, signatures, timestamps, all laid bare in front of millions. And the feed kept rolling because the live stream was mirrored across investor dashboards worldwide. Cutting the broadcast wouldn't erase the screens already glowing in living rooms, offices, and trading floors. The beauty of the design was its simplicity. The truth wasn't leaked. It was delivered through the very system Richard relied on to sell lies. He had given me the perfect stage for the reveal. By the time he realized it, the performance was already over. What remained was not applause, but the sound of wealth evaporating in real time. And for the first time since I'd known him, Richard's smile cracked. The showman had lost his script. The auditorium shifted from polished calm to raw chaos in seconds. Investors who had come expecting a show of confidence now stood frozen, whispering in urgent tones, some already filing toward the exits with phones pressed tight to their ears. On stage, Richard's charm collapsed with the slides. He stammered through half-formed reassurances, insisting it was a glitch, while his voice betrayed the panic rising in his chest. The CFO leaned in, whispering frantically, but the microphones caught every word, broadcasting his desperation to thousands still watching online. Then the second packet hit, landing with precision. This wasn't just red numbers, it was proof. Signed agreements, ignored compliance warnings, layoffs disguised as strategy memos. Each document was branded with his approval, his initials, his authorization codes, the kind of evidence no speech could erase. In the boardroom upstairs, directors argued over each other, some demanding the feed be cut, others insisting it was already too late. The chat window lit up with one word repeated endlessly: fraud. What began as disbelief had turned into a public verdict. Richard didn't just lose control of the narrative, he lost the ability to speak without it sounding like a confession. And while he flailed, the disclosures kept coming in timed intervals, each more damning than the last. The performance was over. All that remained was the reckoning. By the next morning, the headlines were everywhere. What began as whispers in chat windows had become front-page news. The SEC didn't wait for Richard's excuses. They opened an emergency investigation overnight, freezing company accounts and demanding access to every ledger. But the brilliance of the archive was that the fingerprints weren't mine. They were his. Every fraudulent entry carried his approval, his initials, his email chains confirming the orders. The board, once complicit in silence, now turned on him like a pack of wolves cornered in fire. Directors who had smiled during my firing were suddenly red-faced, demanding answers he could no longer fabricate. The CFO's resignation hit the wire within hours, but it was too late to contain the blaze. Regulators had the receipts, and investors had already fled. The empire Richard built on illusions was collapsing in real time, not because I hacked it, but because I simply refused to keep shielding the truth. I didn't destroy him. I unmasked him. And when the mask came off, there was nothing underneath but signatures, lies, and the ruin of a man who thought silencing me would silence the numbers themselves. I didn't watch the rest unfold from the inside. I was gone, my severance intact, my non-compete void the second Richard chose to humiliate me in front of the board. While they scrambled with lawyers and regulators, I sat in a cafe across town, coffee warm in my hands, reading the news like everyone else. My name wasn't in the headlines, and that was intentional. The story wasn't about me, it was about the truth finally being louder than Richard's voice. For years, I carried the weight of numbers that could ruin us if exposed. Now that burden was gone, passed to the people who had ignored every warning. I didn't need revenge speeches or dramatic exits. My silence had been enough. By walking away, I didn't just free myself. I let the company collapse under the weight of its own lies. And that was the cleanest ending possible. They thought firing me erased my voice, but what they didn't see was the storm I'd already set in motion. An archive of truth waiting to detonate at the exact moment they tried to silence me. When the company collapsed live, it wasn't sabotage. It was their own lies finally catching up. What I learned through this wasn't about revenge for revenge's sake. It was about the power of preparation, foresight, and the quiet discipline of telling the truth, even when no one wants to hear it. For years, I carried the weight of numbers executives tried to hide. I could have ignored them, played along, and kept my seat at the table, but doing so would have chained me to their corruption. By archiving proof and protecting myself, I ensured that when they cut me loose, they couldn't bury me with them. The collapse was painful, yes, but it was necessary, and it wasn't mine to own. It belonged to those who built their empire on illusions. The final lesson is simple. Sometimes the cleanest revenge is letting people trip over the lies they insisted were real. You don't have to swing the sword, you just stop holding up the shield. How to get started today. 1. Document your work carefully. Emails, files, approvals. 2. Protect yourself legally. Understand your contracts. 3. Never trade integrity for temporary comfort. 4. Build quiet leverage. Truth has a way of surfacing when it matters most. If this story hit you, let me know in the comments. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe for more.